I've been meaning to do a review of the Test to Resolve rules for quite some time, and indeed a few days ago I filmed a flip through of the whole rulebook, and it lasted more than an hour. And in the end I suddenly realised that actually all I really need to do is indeed show a quick flip through of the rulebook, but more importantly just tell you what makes this rule set different from others and why its innovative way of tackling the structure of the game makes this quite an interesting game to play. So why would you want to play this particular game? So essentially the main things you need to know is the whole game is controlled by a D12. Really you only need one. Obviously I went overboard and ended up buying red and white dice, but you only need one 12-sided dice per player to do everything. And the game is controlled by a set of cards, which we'll go through shortly. But essentially it's a card driven set, and it's a randomised set, so there's cards in there for the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, and as you turn them over it determines who can act and when and so on. So it's, there's an irregular rhythm to the game that is very exciting and unpredictable, and makes for a very interesting playing experience. So of course there's a very good table of contents at the beginning of the book. This gives you a broad brush of what the various chapters and the sections are, so that you can jump straight to them. You'll have noticed that I've added some coloured tabs to the side that does exactly the same, enables you to jump to a particular section. What there isn't, and I'll come to this later on, is there isn't an index in the book, so I've actually written one myself, but we'll come back to that later. So the book starts off with a table of contents, and then there's a few pages that talk about, what the game, the period that it's set in, the Wars of the Roses, and the concept for the game, how and why it's been written the way it has, and what the rules writer envisages for the player in terms of table size and so on. And then it goes on to troop types. So I will show some photographs of how I've based mine. Now I've done mine in 6mm, but you can play it, as you can see in these photos, with larger figures. And essentially you've got various infantry types. You've got mounted household, so that's in the knights basically, and then you have noblemen's at arms. So these are plate armoured men at arms. Then you have retinue, so they tend to be billmen. You have array, which is basically like the conscripts, the soldiers. They were raised, a commission array would raise up troops. So the quality there was much more variable. The amount of armour they wore really depended on what they owned. Sometimes the Lord might issue something, but generally it was, I've got my daddy's armour, I've got his helmet, and maybe a bill or a pike or something like that. So very varied types of troops in terms of quality. Then the backbone of the army in terms of that initial hitting power is archers. The longbow, obviously a very effective weapon at this time period. There's artillery, very early artillery, has to be said, not very effective when we're actually playing, but they can have an impact. They do. Being hit by artillery does make units have to test for their resolve. It's not pleasant being fired at, even with these primitive cannon. Then you have scurriers, basically light cavalry, and then you have various mercenary types, so crossbowmen, handgunners, continental pikemen, very experienced soldiers on the whole, used to drilling in formation and fighting battles on the continent, so they were very experienced, sometimes the most experienced troops on the battlefield, and therefore quite dangerous. And these rules also include the inclusion of kerns, Irish mercenaries. The next few pages go to talk about companies, their classifications and ratings, which can be rolled for or just taken from a table, and how the author has envisages these being based and so on. The difference between a wide company and a mass formation. I won't go into too much detail here. There's a section all on commanders and determining quality. Are they calm, cautious, rash? And when commanders are taken out, killed in a battle, what is their fate? Are they actually killed, or are they seriously wounded? Are they captured? And if they were captured, what happened? Were they executed, imprisoned? Very much a narrative element that I really like, particularly if you're going to play a series of games as like a campaign for using this period. And then we're into the important sections here. Morale, determining, all companies will have resolve points. Generally, an infantry company will have 4 resolve points, and you would put a dice with, or whatever you want to use behind that company to show how many resolve points it starts with. And as the battle proceeds, it loses resolve. When it reaches 0, the unit, the company disperses. But it's all about the strength, the resolve of those companies to stay in the field, and this very much feels right to me. A lot of what I've read is talking about otherwise good troops that might fight well on one day could just lack that resolve to stand and fight on another day. Combination of casualties and morale, fatigue, all these things are summarised in this very simple mechanism called resolve. And the resolve of the various companies determines the overall battle morale test. So most medieval armies will be divided into 3 battles. You take all the companies for a particular battle, add up their resolve points, and that determines how many battle morale points there are. And obviously there's less battle morale points, so as you lose resolve, you take off battle morale points, and eventually that battle might collapse, their resolve might collapse. So now we get to the important bit, the cards. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the card deck. So there's information in here, tells you what all the various cards are, but I'm going to move the rules out of the way and I'm going to show you the card deck. So I bought this card deck from the company. There are actually blanks in the back of the book that you can print out if you wanted to, but I rather liked their artwork and out and so on, so I wanted that. So you've got white cards obviously for the Yorkists, red ones for the Lancastrians, and you shuffle them all together. There's various cards. Some of the cards don't always go in the deck, you might remove them for various reasons, but we'll go through those. So let's have a look around. So a rather annoying card when you get it is milling around. Basically it just means nothing happens that turn. It's an interesting card to insert because you might pull off 4 cards. So what happens is when you have the game deck and you draw off all the cards for a particular colour, so the play deck in this case consists of 1 card, but you could just as easily pull off 4 or 5 cards and go, oh, I can do a lot before my opponent gets to go, and then one of them, the first one, ends up being a milling around card and you've just wasted a card there. So that's an interesting one. That can be quite amusing when that comes up, just when you think you've got a run of cards and you might be able to do a lot. You can't when you get a milling around card. There's a move and melee card, and this applies to just 1 battle. So in other words, you can pick one of your battles to move, and if they make contact, they can melee. A fire card. This is a double card. This is a fire and or strength and resolve. You can obviously fire with any archery troops, and anything that doesn't get to fire or you choose not to fire with can roll to see if they can strengthen their resolve. So if they've taken some resolve points, they have a chance to recover it. Presumably leaders going around and, I don't know, giving them a nice speech or something. But that's a useful one. Use as you see fit, but also use wisely. Another milling around card. End of turn card. There are actually 2 end of turn cards in the deck, one for the Lancastrians, one for the Yorkists, and basically both cards need to come out of the deck before you can say, right, that turn's over, gather together all the cards, reshuffle the deck and start again. So there'll be 2 of those in there. Then we have a very interesting card, Flummoxed. Basically confusion has arisen, and if there's any cards left in the play deck, they now belong to the enemy. So as I said earlier, you would draw off all the cards from the top of the deck that are the same colour. So you might have a set of 5 Yorkist cards. If this comes up in amongst those 5, any remaining cards in that play deck are now the enemies. So you don't want that coming up at the beginning of a nice run of cards, because then all your remaining cards are the enemies, and then they still get to draw their play deck because their card's going to come out next. another fire, strength and resolve. Move and melee. Now this applies to the whole of your army, so you can move all of your battles if you have this card come up. You don't have to move them, but you've got that choice. And any units that make contact can then melee. So we've got some more cards the same here. Flabbergasted. Now this is a fun card. This it's a notable instant. Essentially what it happens is it changes the effect of the card that follows. So if the next card is in your play deck is a move and melee, then the movement distance is increased, or you get a modifier to the first round of melee. Fire has got either a bonus to fire attempts or a bonus to strength and resolve, because they're both on the same card. So Flabbergasted is a fun card to come up because it changes the effect of the card, the immediate card that follows. Then we have missile supply. So essentially it's assumed that all archers are firing away like mad, and actually they would probably run out of their missiles relatively early. When you have this card come up, you have to test to see if individual companies have run out of arrows. If they do, then they would withdraw and form up as light infantry basically behind their haven company, so behind a heavier melee company. So this could happen anytime in that first turn, and so you might find that the archers are withdrawing and that archery phase of the game is over relatively quickly, because you could end up having some units pulling back, and eventually you might decide, right, now's the right time to pull everybody back. Then you have there's another end of turn card in there, a show your colours card. So it's a special type of event where you might have a unit that is undecided what side it's on, or maybe it's not going to fight at all. This gives you a chance to test to see if that company declares its side. And then you've got other types of basic event cards that and there's a range of different types of events that might happen that are unique to particular types of battles. So for instance, in the Bosworth game, if an event card comes up, one of the events is mind the gap. Basically King Richard sees a gap in the Lancastrian line and makes a rush with his knights towards Henry. So event cards are scenario specific, so these don't always end up in the game deck. You might remove them and insert them in the play deck when you get to the second turn. So that's the basic cards, and this card deck, like I say, you would shuffle it, and then you would split the deck, and like I say, you've got the whole deck is called the game deck, and then you draw off a play deck. So in this case, a play deck of one card. The Yorkists would get to fire and strength and resolve, and then you'd put that in the discard pile and draw off the next play deck, which is going to be 2 cards for the Lancastrians. So the first card is going to be milling around, nothing happens, and the second card, missile supply. So even though nothing's happened yet, all the archers may have been firing away, just not very effectively. Now you get to test to see if they've actually run out of missiles, and that can happen right at the beginning of the game. You could choose to remove the missile supply cards from the first set of the game deck, so the first iteration of the game deck. That's an adaptation that you might want to do. I've done that in a game before, just to extend that archery phase of the game. Then the next play deck is going to again be 2 cards, but as you can see here, we go through another set, and then that later play deck, it's going to be 3 cards. So you can get a run of cards, and if you're lucky, that run of cards can be very, very useful. But it could also be a bit of a red herring, especially if you get a milling around card or a flummoxed card, and you end up having to give away the rest of your play deck to the enemy. So that's the card deck, which I think is a really interesting and innovative way of driving this game forward. And the whole turn sequence, if you like, is determined by this set of cards. So next we have movement. It's usually determined by the roll of a d12 with some modifiers for certain troop types, and there's some information about crossing barriers. There's generally a 3-inch cost if you cross any sort of obstacle effect, certain types of terrain and so on. And then we get on to fire, and again everything uses a d12. That's all you need. It's the only dice you're going to need for this game. There's a handy fire chart where all of the modifiers are included in a chart. you may want to reconfigure this and do it as a list. Whatever you prefer, a chart, a table or a list of the modifiers, doesn't really matter. Both sides can use the same chart, but obviously some of the modifiers on here would only be relevant to the principal attacker or the defender. But we'll come back to melee a little bit more later on, determining who those units are. There are obviously various bonuses for different types of activity. So small companies would have a penalty. Close range for longbows is no modifier, but long range is a penalty, and so on. So next we have melee, and again another melee table with all the modifiers on there. That this table can be used by both sides, but some of the circumstances on here will only apply to one side or the other. So essentially, if a unit can move into contact with the enemy, then you can fight a turn of melee, and the unit that moves into contact is the principal attacker, and the unit that it touches is the principal defender. Later on, additional companies can join in as outnumbering companies, but initially it's going to be just two bases touching each other. So there's a bonus for shock. So if you're the charger, you would get a +1 bonus because you've charged into that. But if the enemy is uphill, they would get a bonus. And we're not talking huge numbers here. If you're charging into an archer unit, for instance, then they would have a -2 penalty to their roll, so that's quite a significant one. Fighting troops with armour or knights, they all have an effect on the melee. And then depending on how large the difference is when you do the two opposed rolls, so one side would roll 1d12, the other side would roll d12, apply the modifiers, and depending on the difference, the one that lost, if it loses between 2 and 5 on the dice, then it loses 1 resolve point. If it loses, the difference is between 6 and 9, they would lose 2 resolve points. And if the difference is 10 or more, which can happen with some of these modifiers, then they would lose 3 resolve points. More importantly, whenever you lose, if it's only by 1, then it's a narrow win, a narrow defeat, and the melee continues next turn. On the next activation, move a melee card, that melee would continue, which gives other units a chance to get involved in the fight. If you lose between 2 and 5, if your dice roll is lower by 2 or 5, then you lose 1 resolve point loss, as I mentioned earlier. That also means you lose 1 battle morale point, so you take a point off the battle morale as well. And the losing company must take a resolve test. If it fails the resolve test, it turns tail. Now don't panic too much. Basically, to the resolve test, you need to roll 1 higher than the amount of resolve points you lost. So if you've lost 1 resolve point, you basically need to roll 2+. But it's still a 1 in 12 chance that your unit might break at that point and turn tail. It's a bit more serious later on, because at least turning tail just means you flee from that melee. You roll a dice to see how far you go, and you'd be facing away from the enemy. But if your opposed dice roll was different by between 6 and 9, and you've lost 2 resolve points, again 2 battle morale points come off the whole battle, and then the losing company would have to make a resolve test. Now in this case they'd have to roll a 3+, because they've taken 2 resolve points a loss, and they need to exceed that, so they need to roll 3+ on the resolve table. And there are modifiers, I hasten to add, on the resolve table. We'll come to that in a second. If it fails, it doesn't turn tail, it routs. In other words, it's removed from the table. So that's quite an important one. So as I mentioned, there is a resolve table with modifiers on. So depending on the quality of the troops involved, who's taking the resolve test, are they superior quality or knights, then they get bonuses. Inferior quality would have a penalty. You take a penalty on your dice roll, depending on how many resolve points you've lost. And obviously certain circumstances, such as being isolated, have a penalty as well. So the resolve test is meant to be how many resolve points you've lost. You've got to roll higher than, but there are circumstances, there are modifiers to be applied to that dice roll. So melee can be quite dramatic very, very quickly. So worth pointing out there is a test as well for withdrawal. And withdrawal is different to turning tail. Withdrawal is something you do voluntarily when an arch unit, for instance, decides to fall back. Maybe it's run out of ammo, or the enemy infantry's got too close to it and it decides it's going to withdraw behind its haven company, so behind a stronger melee company, and become a mass formation in its own right. The archers sling their bows and use their light weapons and effectively become light infantry to support the main infantry. So that's withdrawal, which is different from turning tail. Turning tail is being forced to abandon a melee, and then you roll a d12 to determine how far that unit goes, and it's facing away from the enemy. So that's different. So withdrawal and turning tail are different. And understandably, there's a big section on terrain, linear barriers, towns and so on. I won't go into all those details. There's some information, there's some generic scenarios in the book, so what I would call training scenarios, one with just a single battle per side, and then another one which is a full free battle. And in fact, I played this game out myself recently as a sort of practice of the rules. And there's another sort of encounter across the bridge and a river. So a chance for you to take a few units, a handful of units, and play the rules and learn the basics before you get onto bigger, more challenging games. So that's quite an interesting section. There is some additional extra rules that you can include in the game, such as using smaller companies, independent commands, and so on. I won't go into all of that. It's useful. It's useful and interesting, and adds a bit of colour to the game. Now, towards the end of the book, there is a section on definitions, and basically anywhere in the core rules, if you see something written in bold blue, there'll be a definition explanation for it at the end of the book. And this is quite good because you can go here and you can look up something like a Clifford roll and know what is that, or how do units fan out and so on. So all this information is here, and obviously it's in alphabetical order. I've put tabs, as I said, on there to find these main sections quickly. The only thing I would say, as I say, I found the book had a lack. I thought it suffered for the lack of an index, so I ended up I've written one myself. It's not complete. A bit of play testing, and I'm sure I'm going to find things I've missed. When I think I'm satisfied that it's as accurate as it can be and it's done properly, so I've never really done an index before, but once I've done that, I think I'll make that available if people want it. If they've got the rules and they think they benefit from having an index, I'll make that available, but that'll be a little way off yet. I've got a bit more work to do on the index to make sure it's accurate. And that's pretty much the rule book. There is a section at the end. Obviously, you've got a copy of you've got quick reference sheets. There's two on here. One has the fire and melee table, and the other has all of the various tests and the card definitions on. I've actually printed an A5 version and laminated it. I've done several of these so I can actually give them out to the players so that they can sort of help by looking stuff up rather than constantly bombarding me with questions. I live in hope. There's a section with all of the cards on, so you could print these out, you could photocopy these, or you can buy the card set that I've used. And that essentially is the rule book. I think it's a cracking little set of rules. Works really well, very unpredictable, makes for a very fun play. And I think once you've sort of mastered the rules, play can move pretty quickly. I mean, the games I've played have taken a long because I've been filming them and making notes and writing down ideas and so on. Obviously, I'm taking my time over it, and I'm solo playing it, so I'm doing both sides and trying to read rules at the same time. But if you've got two players who are reasonably familiar with the rules, or even learning the rules together, I think games will crack on pretty quickly. Highly recommend checking out the Facebook page for Test of Resolve. One of the authors is on there along with other players sharing ideas, asking questions, lots of information on there. So if you're not sure about anything, and no set of rules can cover every eventuality, and there's always going to be a bit of ambiguity in the way something's written, and you might want to ask a question, well, go and ask one of the authors on their Facebook page, because they're very, very good. So that's it. Very quick, I hope, review of Test of Resolve. and I thoroughly recommend it because I think it's a really good fun set of rules, and I'm looking forward to revealing this and playing this out in the Shed of War at some point. With lots of players in a bigger army, where I basically test and stretch these rules to their absolute breaking point as usual, because I'm not going to be doing a basic set of armies. I'm not going to be doing a few forces like that. Imagine that many units 4 or 5 times over. That's what I mean by stretching the rules to breaking point. I'm not entirely sure they're designed for the armies that I've created, but what the hell, I like doing it like that. So I hope you found that quick flip through interesting and useful. Drop me a line, any comments, and of course, like I say, at some point in the future I will have the index ready to share to people.